Welcome back to part 2 of the Wednesday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins, continuing to record on Tuesday morning. So normally we hang out with Jonathan Feingold, who's been teaching race class with us for almost 4 years now, on Thursday. But today we're going to be doing it a day early. Please forgive me. But I want to remind everyone that we began this class years ago by saying legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and myself are offering a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. In describing the foundational purpose of race class, Jonathan notes, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of exactly what that means." Welcome back to the program, Professor Feingold. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Arnie. It's nice to be with you.
So I don't know if you know this, but I think you do. So for the last couple of years, maybe over a decade now, we cover Texas every single week. All right. And as my audience knows, we began covering Texas when Rick Perry, the governor, was running for president and was under indictment. And we started a segment called Indictment Watch. OK, well, that was how we started. And then we never let go. And it turns out that I was smart to never let go. Not only is Texas produces more wind than any other state in the country, we know about its influence on oil and gas. But what we began to learn was that Texas has a huge oversized influence on the country. From the kind of academic textbooks, for example, for their public schools, California and Texas really decide what kind of textbooks our students will use. We began to realize what they were doing on the abortion issue. They really pushed the envelope there. And of course, Greg Abbott needed to, figure out how to sort of burnish his credentials, and the whole border and immigration story is really, I think we can assign it to Greg Abbott. And from that point, it became really the raison d'etre for MAGA and the Republican Party. So Texas has been really the central point of almost every issue. But when I just spoke to you before you came on the air, you were talking about 3 articles that you want to look at, again, dealing with Texas, and you refer to the fact that Texas is basically following Florida's lead. So as soon as you said Florida, I start to shake, because unfortunately now when I think of Florida and academics, the school that comes to mind is the New School and how they trashed that
New college.
New college, and how they trashed that institution. And now I'm learning what's happening in Texas. So welcome back to the program. And let's talk a little bit about what Texas is doing vis-a-vis higher ed.
Thanks, Arnie. Yeah, and in many respects, what's happening now in Texas is playing off of the Florida playbook, which DeSantis really had an opportunity to experiment with over the past few years with the help of both insiders who wanted to cripple Florida's public education system, both K-12 and higher ed, and outside provocateurs like the right-wing propagandist Christopher Rufo. And you mentioned New College of Florida, which was one of the nation's premier, just small liberal colleges, did really incredible in all sorts of respects. I would point folks to a John Oliver segment in which he covered what was really just a Christian fascist takeover of that institution. There's also a new documentary out, When They Came for My College, that sort of covers it, which is superb. Really presents, a sort of personalized perspective from the students who were there when they realized that their institution was subject to a right-wing coup and the efforts that they took to protect it. And so that was one flashpoint. But what we've seen in Florida is DeSantis and the broader sort of MAGA right that holds formal power in the Florida legislature has um, just sort of pressed forward on this all-out front to undermine higher education in the state. And the way that I increasingly think about the attacks on higher ed is largely an effort to resegregate these institutions, both demographically, pushing out people of color, Black students, Black faculty, but also desegregate it in like a disciplinary sense by pushing out Black studies, by gender studies, so in the disciplines, the fields, and really it's all part of this very sort of open desire to bring us back to before the 1960s. When, if you listen to the folks who are crowing about everything that went wrong in the US and in higher ed, they point to the 60s. And what happened in the 60s? Well, this actually might be news, but there was this very radical thing happened in the 60s. We desegregated higher education. And we said, oh, you know what? As a function of lots of political pressure from all sorts of sides, these can no longer just be bastions for white guys, generally privileged folks. That then brings us to Florida the past couple of years, an effort to really drive this incredibly repressive set of policies that is both about, again, sort of pushing certain people literally out of the institution, but also preventing students from having any exposure to ideas that would equip them to understand the world.
So
And
let me stop you for
yeah,
1 second because I want people to see the continuum because we've been spending a lot of time talking about vouchers. We did it just before you came on the air. We did it yesterday. And I want people to understand that vouchers are also a backdoor way to resegregate schools. It's exactly the exact same thing. So you see vouchers working with the K through 12 situation where they're going to resegregate schools and they're going to resegregate them based on color, based on religion. I mean, there's a whole class, just a whole series of ways they're literally chopping up using public dollars to resegregate America. And then your story of what's happening with higher ed is a continuation of that. Okay. So it really is, they look at the gestalt of education and they're making it the way they want it, to know less, to separate people, to deny people the right for curiosity, to not learn certain things, and frankly, to learn things that if you cherry pick it, creates a falsehood about history and not an accuracy about history. They don't necessarily lie, Jonathan, but if you don't include 10 or 12, critical facts or some underpinning for the story you're telling, what you're telling ends up telling a falsehood, not an accurate story of who we are and how we got here.
no, 100%. And I think one thing that might be sometimes just a little bit harder to appreciate is I think that so much of the really bigoted sorts of rhetoric and policies that come out of the Trump administration and from state legislatures, whether it's Texas and Florida, whether it's in the context of trans kids playing sports, whether it's in the context of really xenophobic approaches to immigration, whether it's efforts to purge universities of Black studies, for example, is I think it really does come from a place of deep, deep insecurity. And it is, insecurity from the part of the folks who now hold a lot of formal sort of levers of power. It is fear. Like when you're trying to prevent students from learning about how gender operates, or just like societally, like what's the difference? There's this word gender, there's this word sex. What's the difference? If you're trying to prevent students from understanding why we remain a racially segregated society, notwithstanding the fact that 65 years ago we passed laws prohibiting discrimination, it's because you're really insecure about what the answer is that students are going to come to themselves when they get to see all the pieces on the board, which is that just the existing distribution of power, of resources, who's in the boardroom, who's at the front of the room, is not natural. And it's not just. It's a function of a lot of different dynamics, some very intentional, others not, that continue to, reproduce a whole set of both gendered and racial inequality. But then there's also this sort of class or sort of socioeconomic piece of it, which is that when students begin to sort of understand how racism or gender and patriarchy shape the world, that doesn't prevent them from also seeing like how people who would racially identify as white are also crushed by the economic system that we work in. And so it opens the door for different sorts of solidarity, cross-racial,
Right.
that actually sort of opens the door to really thinking about, restructuring how we do all sorts of things.
So
And so
Jonathan,
let me
I've
just
always
let me
said
just sort of
I've always said that given the gross inequality that we're seeing in America, the complete almost, evaporation of the middle class, an inability to afford a house until you're 44, if you ever get to afford a house, the idea of medical debt, all these things, I said what they have done with this grotesque inequality is now we're all brown. Okay, they've browned America because what Hispanics and Latinos and blacks have known in this country is they've known what it's like not to be able to attain the American dream. All right, it's been denied to them. They've been racially profiled, all these things. And yet what's happening now, because of the crony capitalism, because of this rise of the billionaire class, because of what they're doing on the affordability issue, it's really interesting. Now, as you point out, we can find these cross currents where we're actually bound together. We're all hurting together. When you can't go to a doctor when you're sick, it doesn't matter what color you are. You just can't go. When you can't buy a house, it doesn't matter what color you are. You can't buy a house. When you go into student debt, it doesn't matter what color you are. You're burdened by debt for the next 40 years. And so what they've done is what historically so many people of color have experienced forever because they were never allowed on the bench. Well, now look what's happening. We're all living that failure. Now we have to actually show people the connections, not what separates us, but what binds us.
So yeah, I think I see things slightly differently in that
Okay,
so
that's
whiteness
fine.
is so whiteness has always been a buffer against precarity,
Yeah,
but it's never
exactly.
been total insulation. And from, if you actually take a sort of a long look at US history, throughout US history, you have a lot of people who we would racially identify as white who are really having a hard time and trying to figure out how you sort of organize against whatever the forces are that are sort of crushing you economically or otherwise. But one of the most powerful forces that has sort of prevented the sorts of solidarity that is necessary for sort of broad swaths of working people to come together is race or racism. And so here you can sort of trace it back to 17th century Virginia, if you want to begin seeing how you have folks who we would think of as the elites who are using racial categories in order to try to drive a wedge between folks who, we would think of today sort of like very working class of European descent and those of African descent. And part of the way you draw the wedge is you sort of scapegoat or demonize, vilify the certain group who'd either, in this context, sort of, and today, be sort of black or brown or what have you, and then create some value or benefit in whiteness, which is a way to sort of split and cleave apart, the mass of
But
people
what's
who,
the value of whiteness if you can't feed your family? What's the value of whiteness if you can't afford the rent? What's the
well,
value of at some point in time, I don't understand when you're all on the same food line. What's the value of whiteness when you can't feed your family? And is it because we've never said these words out loud? We've allowed the lies and the division to basically define the problem. Here's what I did, Jonathan. So you know that 3 soldiers have just recently died in the war in Iran, okay? And so I started my show this way. I'm going to remind you how I started my show. And her name was Isabella Gonzalez. If Isabella Gonzalez was driving in Biddeford, Maine, she might have been stopped by ICE because racial profiling has been okayed by the Supremes. Now she has died for a war no one can explain. Please forgive us. So I took the story of this soldier who died and I tied it to race. And I tied it to Kavanaugh stops. And I now call Kavanaugh stops Kavanaugh killings. Okay? And I want people, as they praise these soldiers and they say all these wonderful things, I want them to look at the fact that what is her name? Isabella Gonzalez. And guess what? She is ripe for a stop.
well, so I guess a couple of things there. All
Oh,
the questions are sort of the right questions, but so one is you're describing so even today, where part of our point of departure is that regardless of one's racial identity in the United States, mo the large majority of us are freaking out about the ability just to make rent or the
right,
next time we get sick. And
right.
so that cuts across. But there remains immense racial privilege in the United States because of the way in which the state targets certain people based on their sort of perceived racial identity,
I hear you.
which in itself is a project of, the people in power in the federal government sort of creating race. Like who is quote unquote American? Whether or not there's some sort of formal statement, we all collectively know that based on like whether how someone is sort of perceived and how that is associated with Americanness or not, which are all these sort of always contested, sort of socially constructed associations, that determines whether or not you're more or less likely to get gunned down in the street,
Yeah.
for being in your car,
Mm.
for bringing your kid to school. But also, and now but to connect it to where we started, how we have people in power that are both trying to push people of color and women in different sorts of ways outside of out of positions of leadership and elite institutions and trying to prevent students from being able to access ideas and texts that would help them make sense of the world. And so
Right.
you ask the question, well, yeah, if you're like poor, if you view yourself, you're white, but like you're like struggling, what does the whiteness matter? Well, a text that, we might read is Du Bois when he talks about the quote unquote psychological wages of whiteness and how even in sort of moments in society where you might still be economically, distressed, if the racial group that you are associated with is the group that's in power, is the group that's in the boardroom, is the group that sits on the jury, that owns the store, there's still psychological benefit to group membership. That
Gotcha.
is, and that psychological wage can actually get in the way of the cross-racial solidarity that is necessary in order to better one's material circumstances.
So you sent me three articles about
Yeah.
what's happening in Texas. One of them is based on a lawsuit. And it turns out that Texas Tech has issued two memoranda to their faculty. And in the beginning of the story that you sent me, they said they looked at these memoranda, two in the last 8 months. So they're really being very prolific here. They don't give them even time to breathe. They write, these vague directives result in an ongoing chilling effect that stifles debate, undermines students' education, and sidelines the expertise that university faculty have earned via years of education and cutting edge research. I mean, it's a three-legged stool on every level. And you have to start asking yourself, so ultimately, what is the goal? And part of the reason why that they are even, sidelining expertise is that if they say that we don't need this topic, then they don't need that faculty. And then if they don't need that faculty, you have to start asking, well, what's the color of that faculty? And what is their area of expertise? And what are they teaching? So they really are thinning out the sort of the academic opportunity. But what's interesting to me, Jonathan, is that as I see what they're doing at Texas Tech, if you were going to a elite school, they actually wouldn't thin that out in the sense that they still want the elite to be well educated compared to everyone else. And yet I'm trying to figure out, why is it for their privilege that they should have this broad smorgasbord of academic opportunity, but then for the rest of us, that is not able to be obtained.
Well, so it's interesting that that you think that, well, the quote unquote elite schools or the schools that view themselves as elite, they're not going to engage in this self-sabotage by cutting out of the core curriculum of courses that are fundamental courses and ideas that are fundamental to just students understanding how the world works. But what's happening in Texas Tech, however one views Texas Tech, is not limited to Texas Tech. All of the public universities in Texas, also Texas A&M, also UT, which certainly prides itself on being a premier elite public university in the world, they're engaged in the same acts of like through different sorts of bureaucratic plays, systematically eliminating from the campus, both from the sort of the physical plant by getting rid of individual departments and the curriculum by these dystopian sort of surveillance of syllabi, basic ideas about racism and gender. And so there was one of the articles that I sent you was out of the Chronicle of Higher Ed on Texas about Texas A&M and M
Okay.
and the curriculum review they did, which for anyone who's just not, familiar with how universities work, it is totally unprecedented for some bureaucrats to demand the syllabi from every course in the university so that they can look through it, find the quote unquote witch words that they don't like, and then demand that content is purged, which is of course pedagogically insane because the goal is not good pedagogy, good teaching. The goal is control.
Yeah.
And very similar to sort of a new college, what was physically removed from new college was their gender and sexuality studies program because ideas that trouble sort of rigid ideas about racial hierarchy or gender norms, that's really scary, not to us, not to a lot of folks, but to the folks who are now in charge of institutions like Texas Tech, like Brendan Creighton, where you had, and so now I'm pulling this from the complaint. You had a professor whose syllabus was flagged because the word systemic was on it.
Yeah.
So and so it is a moment where I think that it's really, really key that we understand that the quote unquote attacks on DEI and how that is playing out, or the attacks on woke and how that's playing out, that's not just part of a broader,
Agenda.
it's not just like anti-civil rights. It's also just anti-academic excellence. Because when you do this, when you're pushing people out and ideas out of the institution, you are undermining the integrity of the entire academic enterprise. And so, like people who care about their universities in Texas, they need to start pushing back really hard because everything that's happening here, and at UT, so, the flagship, UT has been a little bit more elegant in the repression, but UT is systematically eliminating really heralded departments, like their Mexican American Studies department, one of the finest in the world. And recently, the provost and president's this guy named Jim Davis, and the provost, this guy, William Inboden, formerly at the civics, quote unquote, civics institute at University of Florida. They denied tenure to this incredible scholar who got rave reviews from everyone else in the process. So his department, his school.
His
And
students.
so this is very Nicole Hannah-Jones-esque. I don't know if you remember that, where you had,
Yeah, I
this
do.
University of North Carolina, their journalism school, like it would have been an incredible,
Coup to have her.
yeah, to have her. And then because of folks like Virginia Fox,
Hmm.
who, say, well, we can't, this person is too woke.
So
And
it's interesting. So let me just say what I did the other day. This is on July 15th on my Facebook page. And I wrote, if I were teaching a high school class about what is racism and how it operates, both overtly and covertly, I would use the decisions of the Supreme Court majority as my teaching material. Question, would I be fired? All right, this is literally what I wrote. And I wrote, the constitutional vision of the conservative supermajority, this is a quote from an article, represents in many respects a return to the ideals championed by white politicians who fought tooth and nail against the second founding, willfully ignoring racial oppression against formerly enslaved Black Americans, while also denouncing federal civil rights legislation seeking to guarantee racial equality and multiracial democracy. To a striking degree, the position staked out by the court's conservative supermajority echo the opponents of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment back when these amendments were passed. And I even asked the question, if I wanted to teach racism, would I use this court, Jonathan? Oh my God.
And so let me close here. So one of the places where you and I started years ago now was me just sort of concisely sort of explaining where critical race theory as sort of a field came from. And it was part of both a frustration with the failure of formal civil rights laws to actually yield material racial equality in the United
Yeah,
States, but also a desire to understand why that was.
yeah.
Why was it that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't enough to actually remedy all sorts of racial discrimination in society? Which is just, trying to understand why we remain a racially stratified society in which race continues to predict all sorts of outcomes and unequal access to resources. And one of the Texas A&M syllabi, the professor, in order to keep the class, was forced to remove discussion on critical race theory.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that the university administrators are preventing students from being able to even ask the question, well, why is it that racial inequality exists?
And on that note, once a month we do race class with Jonathan Feingold, and this is our response to the restricting of the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities that we have now seen happen virtually all across the United States. We've been talking about Texas in particular. Thank you so much for doing this, Professor Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie.